Imagine being born in the year 1905. The world around you is slow, quiet, and mostly untouched by the chaos to come. Monarchs rule over half the planet, including the mighty empires of Britain, Russia, Austria, Hungary, and the Ottomans. Streets echo not with the roar of engines, but with the rhythmic clatter of horse hooves. In the United States, only 3% of homes even have electricity. Telephones are a luxury, and airplanes, those fragile, trembling kites of wood and cloth, have just managed to lift off the ground for the first time. The idea of war is something distant, noble even, romanticized in novels and poems. Most conflicts, though tragic, are small-scale. Fewer than 100,000 soldiers die annually in all the wars combined. But history has other plans. As the century unfolds, that same child born in innocence would come of age in a world unraveling. By the time they are 9, World War I erupts, a mechanized bloodbath the likes of which humanity has never seen. Trenches filled with mud and death stretch across Europe. Gas attacks blind and choke young men. Entire generations vanish into battlefields. The Industrial Revolution that once promised progress now churns out machines of mass death. Tanks, machine guns, dreadnoughts, and poison gas. By the end of the war in 1918, over 16 million people lie dead. The war that was supposed to end all wars ends only with a temporary uneasy silence. Then comes the interwar period, a time of broken dreams and impossible promises. The 1920s sparkle briefly with jazz, flappers, and radio, but underneath the glamour, economies teeter on the edge. The Great Depression crashes down in 1929 like a divine punishment, leaving tens of millions unemployed, starving, hopeless. Countries turn inward, afraid. Extremism begins to bloom in the soil of desperation. Fascism takes root in Italy, Nazism in Germany, militarism in Japan. The child of 1905, now 30 years old, watches neighbors lose jobs, sees bread lines stretching down city blocks, hears whispers that democracy might not survive. By the time they are 40, it's 1945. The world is now completely unrecognizable. That slow, horse-drawn reality of their childhood has been replaced by bombers screaming overhead, soldiers charging beaches, and tanks crushing cities into rubble. World War II has engulfed every continent. Over 70 million lives are lost. Men, women, and children. Entire cities vanish in flames. Mass exterminations are carried out in camps designed not for war, but for genocide. This isn't just conflict, it's apocalypse in slow motion. And as the war nears its end, something darker still emerges. In August 1945, 2 American planes drop bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Not just any bombs, these are atomic. In a blinding flash, cities are vaporized. People evaporate into shadows, burned into walls. Thousands die in seconds. Tens of thousands more suffer in agony. For the first time in human history, mankind has discovered how to crack the atom. And in doing so, how to unmake creation itself. The world enters the nuclear age not with fanfare but with a scream. That same child born in 1905 has now lived through the fall of monarchies, the rise of fascism, 2 world wars, a global depression, and the birth of weapons capable of ending life on Earth. This is the moment, this narrow window of time, when the very foundation of what it means to be human changes. No longer are we merely creatures of nature, we are now authors of our own extinction. And it is from this crucible of trauma, genius, fear, and ambition that something even more terrifying is born. A secret American project known only to a few, and whispered about in shadowed corners of the Pentagon. A project not just to win wars, but to end them all, forever. And so, as the ashes of Hiroshima settle and the Cold War begins to crackle in hushed conversations, the seeds of Project Sundial are quietly planted. Not in triumph, but in terror. The story of the atomic age begins not with bombs but with equations and chalkboards. In the 1930s, the world's brightest physicists, men and women who once marveled at the stars, began probing the mysteries of the atom. They weren't chasing war, they were chasing truth. But science, for all its neutrality, can't control How knowledge is used. The breakthrough came with a whisper from Germany in 1938. Nuclear fission was possible. When certain atoms split, they released unimaginable energy. The reaction was small in scale, but profound in consequence. The implication was terrifying. What if this energy could be weaponized? And so, the race began. As the clouds of World War II gathered over Europe, the United States launched the Manhattan Project, a secret scientific effort unlike anything the world had ever seen. In the desert sands of Los Alamos, New Mexico, the quiet minds of Nobel Prize winners and young prodigies were sharpened into tools of war. They built equations with the precision of surgeons, but the results were monstrous. They split atoms, not for peace or energy, but for power. Fear drove them. Fear that Nazi Germany would create the bomb first. In July 1945, they succeeded. The first nuclear bomb, codenamed Trinity, was detonated in the early morning light. Witnesses described the fireball as brighter than 1,000 suns. The desert turned to glass. And somewhere amid the awe and terror, the words of physicist J. Robert Oppenheimer echoed through time. "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." Only 3 weeks later, that destructive power was unleashed upon Hiroshima. It was not a battlefield. It was a city full of civilians, children walking to school, mothers cooking breakfast, shopkeepers opening stores. In a flash, everything disappeared. The same fate befell Nagasaki days later. The mushroom clouds that rose into the sky were not just symbols of victory, they were scars upon the human soul. The war ended soon after, but the peace that followed was not the calm after a storm. It was a breathless, haunted silence. Because humanity had crossed a line. The genie was out of the bottle, and the future now trembled beneath its shadow. The bomb had worked. Too well. In 1946, there was a flicker of moral clarity. The U.S. introduced the Baruch Plan, offering to share atomic knowledge under international oversight, to eliminate nuclear weapons entirely. For a moment, the world stood at a crossroads. But power, especially godlike power, is rarely given up once held. The offer crumbled. Mistrust festered, and by 1949, the Soviet Union detonated its own atomic bomb. The arms race had begun. Not just a race of numbers, but a race of nightmares. More bombs, bigger bombs. And behind it all, a chilling question. If we could destroy cities, why not continents? Why not the entire Earth? Among the minds shaping this terrifying new reality was a man who seemed to straddle the line between brilliance and obsession. Edward Teller, a Hungarian-born physicist, had fled fascism in Europe and brought his immense intellect to America. He had helped birth the atomic bomb. But to Teller, it wasn't enough. He was not content with the limits of fission. Where others saw horror in Hiroshima, he saw the threshold of a greater frontier. In his mind, real safety could only come through overwhelming strength, so catastrophic, so absolute, that no enemy would dare to challenge it. Teller became the driving force behind the hydrogen bomb, a thermonuclear weapon not fueled by splitting atoms but by fusing them. It was a leap in destruction, a fire born not of Earth but of stars. The process mimicked the sun itself, unleashing energy that dwarfed anything mankind had ever imagined. He was tireless in his pursuit. Critics called him reckless. Even his peers, including Oppenheimer, grew alarmed. But Teller pushed forward. To him, deterrence was morality. If war could be prevented by the threat of annihilation, then annihilation must be perfected. In 1952, the first hydrogen bomb was tested. It didn't just explode, it erased an island from the map. The blast was over 700 times more powerful than the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. The Pacific shimmered with radioactive fury. The sky changed color. The air tasted like death. And Edward Teller, watching from a safe distance, saw proof that his vision was right. But he wasn't finished. The hydrogen bomb was just a step. What if you could create a weapon so large, so final, that you would never need to fire it? What if you could build a device so powerful that its mere existence would prevent any war, ever? This was not fantasy. This was the seed of Project Sundial, a theoretical doomsday bomb designed not to be used tactically, but as a symbol, a last resort declaration of global suicide. It wasn't just a bomb. It was a message. If you destroy us, we will take the world with us. The logic was chilling. Sundial would not fly in a plane or be launched from a silo. It would sit in one place, perhaps buried in a mountain or deep beneath the ocean. It would be the Earth's own heart of darkness, silent and waiting. No enemy could destroy it before it activated. No one could escape it once it did. Teller didn't view this as madness. He believed it was reason, the ultimate deterrent. But others began to fear the implications. What happens when a man believes peace can be achieved by dangling a loaded gun at humanity's temple? At what point does strategy become insanity? Edward Teller's legacy is complicated. He was a genius, a patriot, a visionary, but he was also the man who dreamed of building the final bomb, the weapon that could end all wars by ending the world, and with Project Sundial, he nearly succeeded. In the shadows of Cold War paranoia, behind locked doors and in the minds of those haunted by visions of the next great conflict, a weapon began to take shape. One that didn't just promise to end a city or even a nation, but all of civilization. It was called Project Sundial. And unlike any bomb before it, Sundial was never meant to be used in war. It was meant to ensure that no war could ever be survived. The name itself was poetic and grim. Sundial, a symbol of time, shadows, and light. Perhaps it was chosen to reflect the cold irony of humanity crafting its own ticking end, or maybe because, like a sundial, this bomb needed no movement to cast the darkest shadow across the earth. Sundial wasn't born in a single moment, but through a crescendo of desperation and ambition. The idea grew in the minds of physicists, military strategists, and political thinkers who had stared too long into the abyss of nuclear annihilation. By the early 1950s, both the United States and the Soviet Union had amassed hundreds of nuclear weapons. Every test was more powerful than the last. The world had entered a bizarre arms race in which the winner wasn't the one who could strike first, but the one who could end everything in return. The concept was simple and horrifying. If you couldn't guarantee victory in nuclear war, then you could guarantee mutual extinction. That's what Sundial was meant to be, a planet killer, a stationary apocalypse machine. A final solution to the problem of deterrence. The design details remain mostly classified, buried beneath layers of national security secrecy. But through scattered declassified notes and whispered testimonies, we can piece together fragments. Sundial was likely to be housed somewhere remote, perhaps buried beneath the American Southwest, hidden on an uninhabited island, or even mounted on a massive mobile sea platform. It wouldn't need delivery systems, pilots, or even human operators. Once armed, it would simply wait. Its only command was annihilation. Engineers envisioned it as a kind of nuclear matryoshka doll, a weapon layered within a weapon within a weapon. The outer shell would initiate a sequence of controlled atomic blasts, each triggering the next in escalating force, culminating in a thermonuclear reaction beyond comprehension. It was to weigh over 2,000 tons and span several hundred meters, the size of a football stadium packed with radioactive death. Project Sundial existed in the realm between science and philosophy, between engineering and madness. Its planners didn't just want to build a bomb. They wanted to create the end of the world in a box, a man-made final judgment, a silent threat hanging over every negotiation table, a whisper in the back of every world leader's mind. If we go down, we all go. But even among the hardened minds of the Cold War, Sundial stirred unease. There were scientists who had built the atomic and hydrogen bombs who now recoiled at the idea of an extinction device. Physicists who had once prided themselves on outwitting nature now found themselves designing the erasure of life itself. Still, the project moved forward, slowly, cautiously, buried beneath layers of protocol and plausible deniability. As far as we know, no prototype was ever fully completed. But the idea of Sundial was real, and in some ways, that was enough. Because, once imagined, it could never be unimagined. The world now had a blueprint, not just for war, but for extinction. To grasp the horror of Project Sundial, we have to look beyond numbers and start imagining real consequences. This was not a bigger bomb. It was not a stronger version of what had come before. It was a category leap, a weapon that transcended warfare and entered the realm of planetary engineering, by way of annihilation. Estimates suggest Sundial would have the explosive yield of 10 billion tons of TNT, a number so large it shatters comprehension. For context, the bomb dropped on Hiroshima released the equivalent of 15,000 tons of TNT. Sundial's energy would be nearly 700,000 times greater. So, what would happen if it were ever detonated? If Sundial had been buried deep in the Nevada desert, the first thing to vanish would be the state itself. The explosion would create a fireball over 50 kilometers wide, a seething sphere of plasma hotter than the surface of the sun. Cities hundreds of miles away, Salt Lake City, Phoenix, Los Angeles, would ignite in seconds. People wouldn't burn, they would disintegrate. Everything would become light and ash. The surrounding land would melt into black, glossy sheets of nuclear glass. Roads, rivers, forests, gone. The earth would tremble with a magnitude 9 earthquake, felt on opposite coasts. Shock waves would ripple outward at supersonic speeds, flattening every structure within hundreds of kilometers. But the real nightmare wouldn't stop there. Sundial's fallout, the invisible poison, would begin to rise. Towering into the sky would be a mushroom cloud stretching into the stratosphere, releasing radioactive particles into the jet stream. These particles would ride the winds across oceans and continents, falling in toxic rain onto farms, lakes, and cities. Radiation levels would spike from Paris to Beijing, from Buenos Aires to Nairobi. The climate would shift almost overnight. Smoke and soot injected into the atmosphere would block out sunlight. Crops would wither. Temperatures would drop by up to 10 degrees Celsius globally, a phenomenon known as nuclear winter. Snow would fall in summer. Famines would break out in even the richest nations. Rainwater would become undrinkable. The ozone layer would be shredded, letting UV radiation scorch the earth. Within a year, the world's food supply would collapse. Billions would die, not from fire, but from hunger. Not from radiation burns, but from the slow, pitiful fade of civilization into silence. Cities would become tombs, nations would fall, history itself would end. And yet Sundial was built by people, human hands, human minds. It was a product not of alien cruelty or mythological wrath, but of cold logic and strategic calculation. In seeking to protect their homeland, its creators had designed something that could murder a planet. But perhaps the most terrifying part of Sundial was this: it never needed to be used to work. Its purpose wasn't destruction, it was threat. As long as the world knew such a weapon existed, peace could be enforced through the threat of apocalypse. And yet, that peace came at a price, because the existence of Sundial meant that our survival was never truly secure. It was conditional. It depended not on wisdom or diplomacy, but on the continued restraint of men under pressure. All it would take was one moment, one misread radar blip, one panicked general, one lost command, and everything would be gone. It's easy to believe that something as catastrophic as Project Sundial was only a theoretical exercise, an academic nightmare shelved before it could breathe. But that's not the truth. Sundial wasn't a myth. It was real. And for a fleeting moment in human history, we came closer to pressing that final button than the world will ever comfortably admit. Behind the closed doors of military briefings and White House war rooms, Sundial haunted decision-makers. The mere existence of the project changed the tone of international diplomacy. It wasn't just a bluff. It was a safety net made of dynamite, a desperate assurance that even if the U.S. were wiped out by a surprise attack, Sundial could still be activated and take the rest of the world with it. There are testimonies, rare, redacted, and often anonymous, of generals who saw the internal plans. Men who emerged from those briefings as pale as ghosts. Some reportedly refused to speak for hours. Others wrote letters in private to their families, confiding that if Sundial was ever deployed, they wouldn't be there to protect them. They had seen what it could do, and they knew there was no coming back. One story, nearly lost to time, tells of a night in the late 1950s when a communication error from a radar station in Alaska showed a swarm of unidentified missiles inbound from the Soviet Union. For 6 minutes, key officials believed the U.S. was under attack. 6 minutes. In that time, authorization protocols were initiated for retaliatory strikes. Phones rang in bunkers. Men entered launch codes into consoles. One general, whose name remains classified, reportedly hovered over the red key that would initiate the pre-arming sequence for Sundial. His finger trembled. Then, just before the final clearance could be issued, another transmission came through. False alarm. A weather anomaly had triggered the radar systems. The world exhaled. Quietly. In secret. But what if that call had been late by just a minute? What if the radar glitch had lasted just a few seconds longer? What if that general, overwhelmed by pressure and protocol, had given the go-ahead? This is the terrifying truth. The apocalypse nearly happened by mistake. Not by war, not by hatred, but by accident. Even within scientific circles, Project Sundial stirred rebellion. Some of the very physicists who had worked on the Manhattan Project were horrified. One researcher, after being briefed on Sundial's chain reaction architecture, reportedly vomited and resigned on the spot. He described it as the death of reason. Another wrote in a confidential journal, "We have created something we can never test, and therefore never understand. If we detonate it, it's too late." And so, Sundial remained in limbo, a sword hanging over the world, never swung, never sheathed. Not because humanity grew wiser, but because even the most hardened war planners finally stared too long into the abyss and blinked. The logic behind Sundial collapsed under its own weight. A bomb that destroyed everyone offered no strategic value. It was too large to move, too powerful to test, and too final to justify. It was, in every sense, a paradox. But Sundial didn't die. It simply dissolved into the doctrine of the Cold War, its soul distributed across arsenals, policy papers, and military contingency plans. The world had refused to press the button. But the button itself had been built, and it remained, waiting. The Cold War was not a war of tanks and trenches. It was a war of imagination, one where the most terrifying weapon was an idea. And in that war, fear became policy. By the early 1960s, the number of nuclear weapons in the world exploded, figuratively, though the threat of literal explosion hovered over everything. In 1946, there were only 9 known nuclear warheads. By 1960, there were over 20,000. By the mid-1980s, that number had skyrocketed to nearly 70,000. The planet was armed like a suicide bomber with a short fuse, wrapped in flags and diplomatic treaties. The doctrine that guided this era was something called mutually assured destruction, or MAD. The acronym was no accident. The premise was that neither the U.S. nor the Soviet Union would dare start a nuclear war if both knew it would lead to total annihilation. Peace, in this twisted logic, came from the guarantee of shared death, and so the superpowers built their arsenals not to use them, but to show them. Entire cities of missiles were planted underground in silos and bunkers. Submarines prowled oceans with dozens of warheads, each capable of wiping out millions. Strategic bombers flew 24/7 across the skies with payloads capable of ending the world. It was an age of insanity masquerading as strategy. Billions of dollars were poured into war games and simulations. Scientists and generals discussed fallout maps and extinction curves as if they were drafting football plays. What would happen if Washington was hit first? How quickly could we respond? How many acceptable civilian casualties could we absorb? The line between logic and madness became impossible to see. This fever dream reached its most terrifying peak during the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. For 13 days, the world stood at the edge of oblivion as the United States and the Soviet Union faced off over nuclear missiles planted just 90 miles from Florida. There were moments, documented in declassified tapes and memos, where a single sentence, a misunderstanding, or a panicked junior officer could have triggered a full-scale war. At one point, a Soviet submarine captain, believing nuclear war had begun, ordered the launch of a nuclear torpedo. His command was overridden at the last second by another officer who questioned the order and refused to turn his key. That one moment of restraint by one man may have saved the world. These stories are not just chilling. They're reminders. The Cold War was never cold. It burned in nightmares. It scorched the edges of reality. And at the center of it all sat the ghost of Sundial, a specter of total annihilation, never deployed but always looming. The existence of such a device changed everything. It reshaped how humans understood war, diplomacy, and survival. No longer was victory the goal. Avoiding extinction became the new measure of success. Children in schools practiced hiding under desks. Cities developed evacuation plans that would never work. Families built fallout shelters in backyards. And across the world, people fell asleep each night under the quiet knowledge that their lives were balanced on a razor's edge. The Cold War wasn't a war of battles. It was a war of breathless waiting, and through all those years of close calls, bluffing, and brinkmanship, humanity never lost the ability to destroy itself. We simply got better at pretending we wouldn't. Project Sundial may never have been activated, but it didn't vanish. It mutated. When the Cold War ended in the early 1990s, with the Berlin Wall torn down and the Soviet Union dissolving into fractured republics, many hoped the era of global nuclear terror would fade with it. But the machinery that birthed Sundial didn't die. It simply evolved. Sundial was never just one device. It was a philosophy, a belief that safety could be achieved through overwhelming, apocalyptic retaliation. And that belief, tragically, still lives on. In the years that followed, the world's nuclear powers didn't abandon the idea of global-scale destruction. Instead, they made it more efficient, more compact, more deliverable. They downsized the Armageddon into smaller, smarter, more usable warheads. No longer were weapons the size of stadiums required. Instead, nuclear payloads could now be mounted on submarines, drones, even hypersonic missiles. The era of the doomsday device quietly gave way to distributed apocalypse. Consider this. Today, there are still around 12,000 nuclear weapons on Earth. That is fewer than in the Cold War's peak, but still enough to kill every living human multiple times over. And the danger now isn't just in their destructive power. It's in their diversity. Strategic nukes, tactical nukes, bunker busters, atmospheric detonators, each type designed for a specific flavor of devastation, and with this diversity comes a chilling illusion: usability. Where once the sheer scale of Sundial made its deployment unthinkable, today's war planners increasingly talk about limited nuclear options, small-scale strikes designed to shock, intimidate, or decapitate a threat without triggering full-scale retaliation. But this thinking ignores one grim truth. There is no such thing as a small nuclear war. History shows that wars, once started, do not obey logic. They escalate. One missile invites another. One city's destruction provokes 1,000 deaths elsewhere. Even a limited nuclear exchange could kill millions, cripple infrastructure, spark economic collapse, and poison the environment for decades. A single tactical nuke could cause a chain reaction that unravels modern civilization. And that's before we factor in modern systems of AI-assisted targeting, automated retaliation, and early warning algorithms. In some countries, machines now help determine whether to launch a counterstrike. What happens when a bug, a glitch, a misinterpreted radar signal triggers the beginning of the end? This is the legacy of Sundial, not a physical device but a mindset. A cold equation burned into the doctrines of military superpowers. It whispers from war rooms and nuclear bunkers alike: we may not use it, but we must have it, just in case. In this way, the dream of Sundial never died. It became everyone's nightmare. Today, China expands its nuclear arsenal with chilling speed. Russia openly parades its latest warheads on national television. The United States pours trillions into nuclear modernization, designing sleeker warheads, faster missiles, and new silos beneath the Midwest. We tell ourselves it's for deterrence, for security, for balance. But maybe it's for the same reason Sundial was conceived in the first place, because we are still afraid. And as long as we live in fear, the blueprint for the end of the world will remain open on the table, ready for anyone, anywhere, to pick it up. Sundial was never just about physics. It was never just about war. It was at its core a mirror, a reflection of our species' deepest fears, desires, and contradictions. What does it say about us that some of the most brilliant minds in human history, people who could unlock the secrets of stars and molecules, chose to build tools of extinction instead? Why, with all our knowledge, have we continued to chase the perfect weapon? The answer perhaps lies in the human heart itself. We are capable of wonder, but also terror, of empathy, but also paranoia. We seek safety, even at the cost of our own destruction. Sundial wasn't forged by monsters. It was built by people who thought they were protecting the world. People who had survived the horrors of global war and wanted to prevent another. People who believed, sincerely, that the only way to stop humanity from killing itself was to create a device so deadly, so absolute, that no one would ever dare to attack. But in doing so, they raised an even darker possibility. What if we killed ourselves by accident, or by misjudgment, or by hubris? To look at Sundial is to see the paradox of progress, that the same intellect which gives us medicine, space travel, and art also gives us mass graves and mushroom clouds, that the same civilization that writes symphonies can also design a bomb to end every note of music. There are survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki still alive today, elderly men and women who carry radiation in their bones and nightmares behind their eyes. They speak softly now, their memories blurred by age, but their message is always the same. Never again. Yet we live in a world where again remains possible, even probable. The children of the Cold War grew up under the threat of sudden nuclear death. They drew pictures of mushroom clouds in school, had drills where they crawled under desks, and learned that survival depended on seconds. Entire generations grew up not learning how to live, but how to not die. And now we hand that world to a new generation. One filled with instant communication, rapid escalation, artificial intelligence, and global instability. We have created systems so complex that no one person can fully understand them, and yet we trust these systems with the keys to the end of the world. We cannot forget what Sundial teaches us, that our power always outpaces our wisdom, that the ability to build something does not mean we should, that the line between genius and madness is as thin as a trigger. Sundial was a mirror. It showed us what we are capable of when our fear is greater than our hope, when our logic outruns our love, and when our brilliance forgets to ask, why? But it also offers a second chance, because the bomb was never dropped, the machine was never finished, the final key was never turned, the mirror still stands, and maybe, just maybe, if we dare to look into it deeply, we'll choose a different path. The most terrifying part of Project Sundial is not that it was built, it's that something like, it still could be. The 20th century taught humanity how to destroy itself. The 21st will determine whether we learn how to survive. We live now in a time of unprecedented duality. On one hand, we are more connected, informed, and technologically advanced than ever before. We can edit genes, map galaxies, and simulate entire realities in machines small enough to fit in our pockets. We can teach a computer to paint, to write poetry, to predict natural disasters. And yet, on the other hand, we remain shackled to ancient instincts, tribalism, fear, greed, pride. We invent gods of metal and code while still worshiping power and dominance. And in the shadow of every scientific breakthrough looms the possibility of destruction. Today, 9 countries hold nuclear weapons. Dozens more could develop them within a decade. Artificial intelligence is being integrated into early warning systems. Hypersonic missiles can cross continents in minutes. Satellites monitor every movement. Cyber attacks can disable entire power grids. And the world no longer has just 2 superpowers. It has many, each entangled in a complex web of alliances, rivalries, and historic wounds. It is in this world, not the world of the Cold War, that the ghost of Sundial still watches. Because the core idea behind it, that we can enforce peace through fear, still drives global policy. But what if we chose differently? What if instead of building smarter bombs, we built smarter children? Instead of investing in mutually assured destruction, we invested in mutually assured understanding? What if we decided that fear wasn't a strategy, but a failure? It begins, as it always does, with education. Every great leap forward in human history has come not from governments or generals, but from the quiet work of curious minds, from teachers who dared to ask questions, from students who refused to accept the world as it was. That's why the work of empowering young people with science, empathy, and imagination matters more now than ever. Imagine a child, not trained to hide under a desk in case of nuclear war, but trained to ask why war exists in the first place. Imagine a generation raised not with drills, but with dreams. Imagine a classroom where instead of fearing equations used to calculate blast radii, kids use those same equations to build clean energy, design medical technology, or simulate life on other planets. That's the kind of future we can still create. Organizations today, like KiwiCo and others, offer small glimpses into that hopeful future. With hands-on projects, children can build mini-robots, design working machines, and explore the laws of nature, not to weaponize them, but to wonder at them. They can learn that science isn't just about power, it's about possibility. That knowledge isn't just for safety, it's for stewardship. Because, here's the truth, science isn't evil. Technology isn't evil. Power isn't evil. It is how we choose to use them that defines our path. Sundial was a fork in the road, and we did not walk it all the way. We stopped. We turned back, but the trail is still there, waiting, tempting. So, now we ask, will we walk it again, or will we finally close the chapter? The future is still unwritten, and though the weapons of yesterday still haunt our world, they do not have to define it. We can build new systems, of trust, of education, of innovation. We can teach empathy alongside engineering. We can tell stories not just of destruction, but of resilience. We can leave the shadow of Sundial behind, and perhaps in doing so, we will prove, finally, that our species is not defined by its ability to end the world, but by its ability to choose not to.